This is a presentation about cascading style sheets. We've already seen some of this material, and so I'll probably run through it kind of quickly here. And basically, I think you kind of got the idea now that the style sheets contain the presentation material, the formatting, and then the HTML5 contains the actual content and the kind of structural stuff for the page. So you're going to see that we can use the style sheets to do everything that we want to format the pages. We have really a lot of control now over the pages, including the layout. We'll see that we're going to write alternate style sheets for different form factors with things called media queries. And I'll talk about those later on. So we'll be able to get a single page that works on multiple form factors, a phone, a desktop, a tablet, and it'll work real well. Okay? So these style sheets kind of come from the style sheets that Word and the other word processing software uses, and they've kind of developed. A lot of this I'll let you read. I'm not going to go through every word on the slides. Okay? I tend to write the slides for you to review on your own, so they're very text heavy. They're not really designed for a presentation. Okay? So the current version of this is CSS 3. Most of that's now implemented. There's a couple of little fringe areas that are not implemented the same way in each browser, and we'll see that we use browser prefixes for those. So you actually end up writing the style rule multiple times, so whatever browser the user is using, the rule will work. There's only a couple of places where we do that. When I show you how to do the rounded corners for the borders, that's one place, and the other is a special kind of background color called a gradient. And so a gradient is actually a kind of range from one color to another. And if you do any visual design, you know what a gradient is and you're familiar with it. So we have three types of style sheets. And we're really only going to use the first type, which is the link. So this is when we have the styles in an external file. And it turns out that that's best practice. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it completely separates the content from the design, which means that in a larger corporation kind of industry setting, I can have someone who's a specialist in design do that part, but I can have a programmer or a media content area person do the other part. The other advantage of the linked style sheet is I can have one style sheet and link many pages to it. What kind of advantage do you think I get from that?
Your pages will all be formatted the same way.
That's right, yeah. So we get a common style for a site. So if we think of a website as a collection of linked pages, it's really good to have a consistency of style across the pages. People are used to that. Embedded style sheets are in the head of the document, and then inline, which you should almost never use, are right in the markup, and they use a different syntax. One of the reasons you want to learn the embedded is the W3 Schools examples and many other books. As a pedagogical practice, they use the embedded sheets. You can see the style right in the same file as the HTML markup. So we're never going to do that in our assignments, but you want to be able to read that. Okay. So again, the linked style sheets are the ones that we want to use. I used to tell a funny story about somebody who's working and their boss calls them up on a Saturday and says, "Hey, I want to change the background color on the site. How long will it take you to change the 50 documents that make up the site?" And the guy says, "Oh, maybe 4 or 5 hours of overtime." Then he goes in and he changes it in 5 minutes in the style sheet. So, not a funny story, but not an ethical one. Okay, so the way we do the link style sheets, and you've already actually seen this, is we create a link tag in the head of the document. You can see an example here, and you can see that we have attributes of ID, relation, rel, href. What's the href now? We've seen that. Yeah, it's a hyperreference. So it's the same that as we use to create hyperlinks. So really that's just saying that the external information, the style information, is here, and the href is a path that leads to that. Now, because this href just has a single thing, which is a file name, what does that imply about where that file is located in relation to this document that this information is in? Yes?
It's in the same parent directory?
They're in the same folder, exactly, or the same directory, exactly. So that's a relative link. And again, you'll start to see that usually we will have a sort of root directory. We'll put all the website files in there. We might have some subdirectories, but all the links within those are going to be relative, so we can move it around easily. So we can, for instance, develop it locally and then upload it to a web server. So the rest of this is pretty boilerplate. Although you can give the style sheet an ID, it's rarely used. The relationship, style sheet, and the type, text/CSS, they're always going to be the same. It's possible to have multiple styles linked in, and especially when we use jQuery Mobile, you'll see that. And then again, the embedded style sheets, the reason I want to show you these is simply so you can read them, and when you look at the W3 examples. So these go in the head of the document, and basically you should already recognize this as a style rule. So we have a selector over here on the left, and then I have a single attribute which is called font size. I'm sorry, I have two attributes. The first attribute is font size, which is set to 24 point. And then the second is the color, which will actually be the color of the text, which is set to red. So this is exactly the same way it would appear in an external or linked style sheet. It's just here in the head of the document. Again, we won't do that, but when you look at examples in the textbook and on the W3 school site, it's often done that way just because you can see the style right there, and it makes it a lot easier to kind of cognitively get what's going on, okay? But again, the best practice for websites is to externalize all the style in a linked style sheet. Don't ever use the inline style sheets. These really evolved from early HTML. And so you have what's called a style block, and notice the equal sign there, so it's really an attribute. So it doesn't actually have the same format as the external and the embedded ones. So you might see this, but we're not going to use that. Okay, real quickly, one of the reasons it's called cascading is basically each type overrides the previous one. So linked is the general type, and then if you have style in the head of the document, that's going to override the linked one. When I say override, only the rules that conflict will override, okay? So one approach is to have all my general rules in the external document and then put specific rules for this particular page in the head, okay? But generally we're not going to do that. And then finally, if you have inline, that overrides everything else, okay? By and large, you're not going to do that. In some special cases for performance and things like that, you might do that, but we won't do that in here. Okay, I think I already went over this. The basic format is we have a selector. We have different types of selectors. We talked a little bit about this. And then within a rule body, which is demarked by the curly braces, beginning and ending, I have a property value pair, which is called a tuple. And the property has the colon here after it, and put a space in there just for readability. It's not required, but you want to get in the habit of doing that. And then, although if I only have one, it's not needed. When I have multiple rules, I have to terminate it with a semicolon. Best practice is just to always put the semicolon in, okay? So here, what is this? What's the H1 here? That's the selector. And this particular kind of selector is called an element selector. So this is going to be a rule that applies to every H1 in the document or any documents that are linked to this style sheet if it's an external style sheet. And then I have two rules here. The first, I'm setting the font size to 24 point, and then the second, I'm setting the color, which is really the text color, to red. Okay. I thought I had changed these. You really should not use points in a general style sheet. So I mentioned that we can use the media queries to create style sheets for different form factors. We can also create them for different devices. So whenever I write for the screen, I want to use relative measurements, EM, and percents. And the only time I'm going to use the PT, the point here, which is the same as your word's processing point, right, like 12-point font, is when I do a style sheet for printing. So when I use absolute measurements, that'll be in a printing style sheet. Normally I won't do that for a screen style sheet. And that's kind of a obscure thing. Like I don't always write a printing style sheet for every website that I develop, right? Okay, so this first kind of selector, we talked about this last time, is called a simple or element selector. And the idea here is that whatever rules that I have in this rule body are going to apply to every H1 element in any document the style sheet is linked to. Okay? Then we have class selectors, and basically to use a class selector, I create a class name and I use a dot to separate the elements. So this is a type of H1, or we could say a class of H1. Okay? So here I have one called hot, and I'm simply going to set the color to red. Now, to differentiate this, I have to indicate that in the HTML that this H1 is of this class. So I use the class attribute. So this rule is going to apply only to H1 elements which have this class. It won't apply to others. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So one thing you might not appreciate immediately is this allows you to create your own style library. So for instance, I think you've already seen in doing the assignments that we have p.norm text, which is normal text. We also have p.song text, which is text when it's in a song, or p.poem text when it's text in a poem. So if you think about that, that's a specific kind of style I've written for the paragraph element based on its context. So what I've really done is I've created several classes of paragraph styles. One when I have normal text, one when I have abstract, one when I have song or poem. Do you see that? So it kind of lets me start to create this reusable palette of design choices that I can use. The next kind of selector is called a generic selector, and a generic selector begins with a dot, and what happens here is this is sort of like a class selector, except it doesn't specify what element, so it can be any element. So these are typically real general kinds of rules that I can apply to other multiple kinds of elements. So here we have one called dot left, and you can see that I'm setting the margin right to 50%. So if I do that, that means the right-hand margin is going to move almost to the center of the page, which is really going to force the content that this is being applied to be on the left-hand side of the page. And then if you look down here, we have an H1 has class equals left, and a paragraph which is class equals left. So this is a general kind of rule, a generic rule, and I can apply it to any element. And again, I use the class mechanism within the HTML markup to do that. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we have the contextual or descendant selectors. We've already seen this because I went out of order and I talked about the how to do the linked the lists. So can someone tell me what we have here? What's going on here with this OL space LI? Yes?
Order list?
Yeah, but let's say a little bit more. What about the ordered list?
You're specifying the style within a particular element?
Exactly. I'm specifying the style of the list item when it's in an ordered list. And similarly, the next one would be a list of styles to apply to the list item when it's in an unordered list. So this is called a contextual or descendant selector. I think you can see very clearly why it's called a contextual selector, because really it's a rule for a list item when it's in a certain context, when it's in an ordered list in the first case or an unordered list in the second. The reason we call these descendant selectors is because of the hierarchical structure of the page. This element is within another element. Okay, so when we talk about these documents, it turns out that they're what are known in computer science as hierarchical structures, which are commonly referred to as trees. And it's useful to kind of have this nomenclature down. So a computer science tree is upside down, the root is at the top, and the leaves, the terminal nodes, are at the bottom. Can you think of a tree structure that you use all the time when you use a computer? Your file system. So your C drive is the root drive, and as you go through the folders on the drive, you're going down, and when you reach the terminal nodes of the tree, of the leaves, those are the files in the system. So a file path is another example of one of these computer science trees. So when we talk about these trees, because of the way we do human genealogy, we've kind of inherited nomenclature. So we'll talk about child elements, ancestors, and again, you can say ascendant or descendant here. So that's where that comes from. Okay, you got a little extra money today. I gave you some computer science theory. All right, next we have the ID selectors. These are real specifics. You can only have one element with a given ID in any document. And so these begin with a pound sign. And this isn't really a great example because that's a stupid name, right? I usually would use a meaningful name, like when I use variables, okay? But basically, you can see I have a level 1 header with an ID of ABC123, and then this rule only applies to this single element in the entire document, okay? You've already seen that you can combine these. So for instance, if I have a section of my page with an ID of bio, then I can say pound bio space P, and that's going to be a descendant selector that's based on an ID selector. So you start to see how this is going to give me a lot of power to specify individual parts of the page and then apply the style that I want to them. Yeah, this is good. It's very powerful technique. Let's look at some examples here. So the first one we have is H1, font size 24 point. What's that going to apply to? A little bit louder.
The font size in header 1.
Yeah, and that's going to apply to every header 1 element. So if I have multiple ones in the page, it'll apply to each one. It'll set the font size to 24 points. That's exactly right. How about the second one, h1.hot? Okay, but tell me a little bit more. What's the .hot mean? You're right, it is a rule that specifies the text color, but how does this selector work?
Whatever is in the header that's an element hot.
Class, a class of hot, right? So we have to use, that's only going to be the H1 headers. First off, the rule will only apply to H1 elements. And then secondly, even more specifically, it'll only apply to the ones that have a class of hot. Okay, so that's a class selector. And then the third one we have dot left. What kind of selector is that? Generic. That's a generic selector. So that'll apply to any element of that class. So if you look here, look at the examples we have. So if I just have an H1 element, it's only going to use the first rule. If I have an H1 element with a class of hot, it'll use both the first and the second rule. That's important. So this says I want all of them to be 24 points, but this one here says if it's class hot, make the color red, and then the color presumably is some other color if it's not class hot, right? And then if we look at H1 class left, that's an H1, so it's going to be 24 points, but because it's class left and not hot, it'll be on the left-hand side of the page. And then finally, we have a paragraph of class left, which will only use the third rule. Why does this only use the third rule?
Because, sorry.
Go ahead.
Because it's not part of the H1.
Yeah, it's not an H1 element. So these rules can only apply to H1 elements. The second one can only apply to an H1 element when it's indicated that it's class hot. Okay? So you see how the rules give us this control over what parts of the document we want to apply. And usually what happens is we're going to try to use rules that are most general, and then we'll have overriding rules that are more specific for our sort of exceptions. Okay? Okay, this one's sort of obscure, but you can actually specify a selector for an attribute. Okay? So basically, this is going to be a rule for a hyperlink element, an anchor A, when it has a relation attribute which is equal to license. Okay? So you can see that this is similar to the class, but it's based on an attribute. And again, it's more specific. Is it okay when you guys see this curly brace and it says style rules? What does that mean?
The rules like font style, font color.
Exactly, sure. Any of the rules that I can use. So I could have 10 or 15 rules in there, actually. Okay? All right, we also have one that lets us do, this is called a pseudo selector. And this operator here with the circumflex and the equal sign, that's actually from the Perl language, and that means contains. So this one lets you apply style when an attribute contains something, as opposed to this one, which is when the attribute is equal to something. Okay? So this one will say, as long as I have the word met within an attribute called relation, then apply this rule to it. And of course, that's going to be applied to an anchor. That's pretty obscure. You probably will never use that. Okay? Okay, so we have all kinds of properties, literally hundreds of properties. This is one of the places that Dreamweaver really comes in handy. You've already seen that in class when I use Dreamweaver and I start to put a style in. It has that drop-down list, and it does the IntelliSense, and it'll match my typing and go right into the list. So, I mean, there's literally hundreds of these style attributes. Some are super obscure, very specific. I actually don't know what all of them are or how they all work. I generally teach you a kind of functional subset of those. But feel free to push yourself. If you see an attribute that you don't recognize, look it up, see what it does. You'll definitely learn a lot more. For coding these, let's always put the selector on the left-hand side. Only do one property value per line. Indent the property values, and then observe the other syntax rules. So you have to have a semicolon at the end of each property value. Never put any HTML code in the CSS style block, okay? Or the external CSS linked file. If you want to put a comment, what's a comment?
Allows you to read your code you're doing there.
Yeah, that's something for the user. It's not for the machine, right? So the machine will ignore the comment. And in CSS, the comments look like block comments in Java. And that is a block comment, so you can have multiple lines there. So it begins with the slash and the star, and then it ends with the star and the slash, okay? I think Dreamweaver by default always puts one at the top. And it also puts the encoding in, which I've never really read about, but I always just leave that in. Okay, one thing that you'll start to notice is that styles are inherited. So for instance, if I put the color on the body of the document, all of the, and I'm talking about the background color, all of the elements within the document, unless I specify a different background color, will inherit that. Is that a good thing? Hell yes. Think about how tedious it would be to go through and have to do every style for every element in the page, right? That's a great design. So basically I will typically start by putting the general kinds of rules like my color, font size, stuff like that, kind of high up, and then I'll write the exceptions where I want to change those things. Okay? So we talked about block and inline elements, and I actually showed you how I could use the display attribute to change the hyperlink from its default inline to its block to make them go one per line. We have two structural elements called a div, which is short for a division, and a span. A span is an inline element, and it's just an arbitrary begin and end point for something I want to apply style to, okay? So for instance, within a paragraph, I might want to put emphasis on a specific element, and I could do that with a span, where I put a span tag around part of the paragraph and then indicate that I wanted that in a different color or a different font size, whatever, okay? So spans are inline elements. Divs, divisions, are block elements. And later on, when we start to look at how we can create pages that have structural elements with like multiple columns and things like that, we'll use the divisions for those, okay, the div elements. So for instance here, if I did this div.left, margin right 50%, that would actually be a structural element where I'd start to create a multi-column document there. So that would be the left-hand column. Okay? Don't worry too much about that. We'll do layout completely separately. We'll talk all about it. So before we do that, we're going to learn quite a bit of the basic HTML. So we use the CSS to do the layout. Okay, so all block elements support padding, margins, and border. That doesn't mean you have to have a border around everything, by the way, okay? And this is called the box model. Here's a great diagram that shows this. So I have some content, which is typically going to be text. It might be something like a list. It might be an image. We'll talk about images this week. And then between the border, which I don't have to have, and the content, I have an area called padding, okay? And then in between the border and other elements, I have an area called margin. Does that make sense? So basically, if I have two elements in my page that are next to one another, they're going to be separated by their margin. They might have or might not have borders around them. And this applies to block elements. You can't put a border around an inline element, okay? And then I usually want to have some padding here. So for instance, if I've got a paragraph here and I want to set it off by putting a border around it, I don't want the text to butt up against the border. That's kind of ugly, right? So I want padding there. So that's what the padding is. Now, margin, border, and padding all have 4 elements. So I can specify separately the top, the bottom, the right, or the left. And so we just hyphenate this. And we'll see this in a second. So here's an example. I have a division element which has an ID of subhead, which is kind of short for subheading. And then within this subheading, I have an H1 element. And then you can see here that I've got a border color of black and the border style of double. So double is going to be a double line. And there's about 7 or 8 border styles. Okay, we'll go into the borders more detail here later. And Dreamweaver is really a nice way to just look at the different styles that are available. I almost always just use the solid style, which is just a solid line. You're going to see that you can control the color of the border. That's what this does. So it says the border color should be black. The border style should be double. I could go further and specify the width of the border as well, although I don't tend to do that too often. Okay? So here's an example, and here's this subheading here, and you can see the border around it now. Now, it sort of seems like the slide lost its point, because what I should be talking about there is doing the padding in that. And it seems like I just kind of forgot about that. So what we would do is we would put padding, and if you just say padding, it's going to take the same value for the top, the bottom, the left, and right. If you want to specify different padding, then it becomes padding dash left, padding dash right, padding dash top, padding dash bottom. The same with the margins. So if you look here at the margin, I can just say margin and give a value, and that means all 4 sides. Or I can expand it and use margin dash top, dash bottom, dash right, dash left, like that. Okay? Again, unless you're writing a style sheet for a printing media query, you should only use relative measurements. So the EM units, which are measurements based on the size of the font. 1 EM is medium-sized font. And percentages, which basically are going to be a percentage of the containing document, which ultimately is the percentage of the screen size. Okay? So can you kind of see that if I do this, I can create things that will sort of expand and be flexible based on whatever size device I'm actually looking at them on, which is what we want, okay? Now, I can do this in an absolute way. So I can use points, PT, like your printing measurement. I can use PX, which are pixels. Do you guys know what pixels are? Everyone knows what pixels are? Those are the little dots that make up the computer screen, right? So one approach is to say, hey, I want a page that's 600 pixels wide. I don't care how much screen space you've got, I'll just center it. So some people do web design like that. I prefer to do flexible design where we try to use all the screen space and create designs that expand accordingly. Okay? So if we look here, we have just a couple examples. Here we're applying a top margin of 3 EM to the body of the document, and then a left-hand margin to the H1 element of 10%, which will effectively kind of indent the H1 element. So with these margin properties, and then you'll see later you can do the same thing with padding, you can do shorthand. So if I say P margin 3 EM, 3 EM, 1.5, 1.5, or P margin 3 EM, 1.5, that's going to basically be, these first two are the same. So this is going to be the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. If I only give 2, it assumes that I mean this to be the top and the bottom, this to be the left and the right. When I do that with only one value, it assumes I mean to put the same value for all four sides. Okay? So that's kind of a shorthand. You'll see that we do it the same way with the padding. Okay, when we specify the fonts, these are the fonts that are available on Windows systems. We also we have what are called font families. So best practice for using fonts is to specify several different font faces because you don't know what kind of machine people are using. Okay, so best practice is you might pick several established fonts and then you use what's called a generic or CSS font. Now, this is difficult to explain and it's kind of tedious, but the reality is Dreamweaver does this for you. Anytime you pick a font in Dreamweaver, you'll notice that it always has like 3 choices. And so what will happen is if the machine doesn't have the font you want, then it'll go to the next choice. Finally, it'll go to the generic choice, which will almost always work. If nothing works at all, it'll use whatever the default system font is. Okay? So you can play around and look at the different kinds of fonts, and I think your book talks a little bit more. These are the generic ones from the CSS. So if you look at this rule here, H2, font family, Arial, Helv, which is short for Helvetica, and then sans serif. So sans serif is the generic font. What does that mean, by the way? Anyone know? Yes?
A lot of letters and characters will have like little edges. Like T will have like these little like corners of the edge. It's just whether or not it has the styles. Like that F.
That's exactly right. So we call those embellishments. And basically the letter itself, at the end of the strokes that make up the letter, it can have these little embellishments. And those are called serifs. And so sans is a Latin word that means without. And so that means it doesn't have the serif. And so basically this would be a sans serif font with no embellishments, and then this would be a serif font that has them. I always get confused about this. I think your book talks about which one works better for reading. So if memory serves, you're supposed to use the sans serif fonts when you have a lot of text and people are going to read. I probably got that backwards though. Let's see. Again, you can use absolute measurements, but only for printing style sheets. So generally you want to use the EM unit and not the other ones here, okay? So again, we want to use EM for screen type stuff. Most of the time we're going to write for screen. We won't typically write printing style sheets. Okay, I'm going to let you go through this here. I'm going to pass through. There's some of this stuff isn't used really a lot. Okay, so you can change the keyword, the font size with a keyword, as well as using the EM measurements. And these are okay because they're relative. All right, they're not specific to a certain size. So again, the best practice is use the EM for screen CS, which is what we're writing right now, CSS. And then PX or PT for print documents. Okay. Font weight is the size of the line. So bold, for instance, you understand this intuitively. So we have some keywords we can use for this. And you can also apply the bold with the style here too. So font weight, bolder or lighter is relative. Those aren't used too commonly. These are though. We just use these default font weights. Again, Dreamweaver will have a drop down for you. If you want to apply a style to the font, like italic, oblique, or a special decorative style that we use for sort of like in-page headings in that, you can use small caps. That's what that is. And so you use the font style for these. And these two you can use multiple ones, right? So obviously I can't have it italic and oblique at the same time, but I can use italic or oblique with the small caps. So that's how that works. Okay. I think we've already seen this, right? Didn't I have you do this for your text in your bio or your song? Pardon me. Then we have the text decoration, so you can underline, overline. What is line through? That's where the text has a line drawn through it, and that's typically for things like contracts, formal documents, sometimes a group's constitution or bylaws will have that. What that does is that retains stuff that's been changed. So you can see that this is now outdated, that we've changed stuff. I don't know if they still even have the blink. Don't use that. Blinking text can create epileptic seizures in people that have epilepsy. When I first started doing this a long time ago, that was the cat's meow. Everybody had blinking crap on their web pages. So. But now we don't do that. I always get this confused, so I tend not to do it. But if you see something like this here at the bottom, that's basically a bunch of font styles all kind of arranged in a shorthand. So you could see that I have font, then the weight, a style, the size, the line height, we didn't even talk about that, and then the family. So you can use that. I tend to just write everything out. It's easier to read and understand. If you do this every day, though, you like these shortcuts and you get used to reading them. Line height I didn't talk about. That controls the space between the lines. There's also one called word spacing that allows you to adjust the space between the individual letters. And this is the way that the font, when you use the shorthand, they have to be in this order, okay? Also, real quickly, if you have a font like Times New Roman that has spaces in the name, you have to double quote that. Otherwise, the parser won't read it correctly. It'll read Times New Roman as three different things. Text indent, you want to use this on all of your normal paragraph elements. The ones that don't get indented are things like abstracts for formal, papers. And of course, when we have a poem or a song, we don't typically indent the stanza, the first line of each stanza. But for any normal reading paragraphs, put the text indent on there. Usually we do that as 1 or 2 characters, which is going to be 1 or 2 EM units. Okay? Okay, so again, I kind of went out of order here. We've actually already looked at the hyperlinks and the lists, and some of this I covered in a kind of practical way as we were working. So